Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And if you haven't joined us before, we take the books that are on your bookshelves, blow off the dust, and we go through them chapter by chapter so you can actually say that you read them, or at least, at the very least, watched a podcast that went through the books that you should be reading as well. And
there you go.
That's our job, and we're in the midst of looking at 4 different methods of apologetics in this book called Faith Has Its Reason and Integrative Approaches to Defending the Christian Faith by Kenneth Boa and Robert M. Bowman Jr. And so we've gone over this book before. We really liked it. We think that it really presents different cases fairly accurately and completely as well. And so the length of the book shows that. And so our pace also shows that that it's the case that they have a lot of things to say. And of course, we have a lot of things to say on top of that as well.
Yeah.
And so we're in chapter 6, which is we're kind of completing the points for the classical approach. And so the classical approach is kind of codified as focusing on reason, and then their methodological approach is this kind of 2-step approach of using reason to get the unbeliever to see the logical possibility of there being a single God, and then from there, then using a historical approach to show that Jesus is the Christ and he is God, and therefore makes the complete package of the Christian case. And so now what we're going to do is we covered kind of the 6 different questions that have had that each model has to answer. And so we've done that in the past 2 episodes. And so now we're going to look at the rationality of the Christian worldview and see what the classical model has to say about that as well. All right, so starting off, our authors talk about the classical approach seeks to show that the Christian worldview is rational or reasonable and therefore worthy of belief. The characteristic approach that they take to accomplish the task is this 2-step or 2-stage argument. First, the classical apologist seeks to demonstrate that theism, the general type of worldview that affirms the existence of one personal creator God, and that is associated historically with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, is true. And arguments of the deductive logical structure, proofs, is the usual strict sense, are typical of this stage, although many apologists in this tradition also use empirical arguments and claim only to show that there are good reasons to think that God exists. And so we'll kind of unpack that a little bit more as we go.
Yeah, so basically, as you mentioned now, that this is a 2-step approach. So this first step, right, is to show that God exists, or at least a theistic God exists, right? And then the second step or stage of the apologetic from the classical apologist perspective, given the existence of God, which they have various proofs that we'll look at some of those now. The evidence for Jesus Christ and the inspiration in the Bible are sufficient to show that Christianity then is the true religion. So at this stage, the arguments are usually, more inductive as opposed to deductive. So they're not proofs per se, but they're inductive arguments. And in fact, they're typically identical to the sorts of arguments used by another approach that we'll take a look at, evidentialist, right, in regard to such subjects as the resurrection of Christ. So this chapter examines the classical methods, that's the method we're looking at, their answer to 6 questions about Scripture, other religions, God, evil, miracles, and Jesus. So that's what we'll walk through in this particular chapter, get a good look and a feel for how the classical approach deals with these various 6 questions.
Mm-hmm. And as we go through the 4 main types, the past 2 episodes that we did looked at kind of the 6 relationships that the certain method has towards things like logic and philosophy, theology, historicity, Scripture, and personal experience. And here are the kind of the 6 questions that kind of all apologists should be kind of on the hook for. And so, as Tony mentioned, the 6 are the scriptures, other religions, God, evil, miracles, and Jesus. So that's what chapter 6 is going to be, as we start with scripture as conclusion. Well, one of the most fundamental questions concerning apologetic methods is the role of scripture, and that it plays in the apologetic argument. In general, the classical approach seeks to make the existence of Scripture as a body of inspiration and authoritative writing the conclusion of the whole apologetic. So, they're not going to start off with it. They're going to say, here are certain proofs. Here's the cosmological argument. Here's a good reason to believe that Jesus exists. And then ultimately we find his full authoritative, faith-filled message in the scriptures. And so let's open that up. So that's the end of their apologetic argument is the scriptures.
Right. And so in treating the authority of the scriptures, as a conclusion toward which an apologetic is directed, classical apologists seek to avoid what they believe is begging the question, by assuming that the authority of scripture and apologetic arguments are directed toward unbelievers. So they don't want to beg the question and start with scripture. They want to first show that God exists and then move to a conclusion that scripture, then the biblical scripture, is the correct revelation of God. So these apologists argue that, notice, reason must judge the credentials of any alleged revelation. So reason is key for this particular approach. God gave us our faculty of reason and expects us to employ our reasoning abilities both to recognize His true revelation and to detect the fraudulent revelations of other religions. So that's kind of their approach with regard to scripture.
Right. So classical apologists believe that human beings are responsible to use their reasoning facilities to, as 1 John 4:1 says, test the spirits to see whether they are from God. They deny that testing revelations from God is a manifestation of human autonomy that elevates the mind as the final authority for truth. And so some other methods might charge them with this, but they say, no, that's not the case. We're not hanging our hats on human autonomy, but that this is kind of scripturally based of what we should be doing. And so there are arguments to get into that, and the 5 Views book that we recommended several episodes ago, that does a good job of being more contentious than what we're being at in this book. Well, here, rather than just as it is reasonable to look at for credentials before submitting to human authority in any given field, so it is reasonable to submit to the authority of revelation once it is shown to be well-founded on the basis of God-given rationality. So again, the authority of Scripture then is put forth secondary and rationality, whether we can know it, whether it can stand up to what God has given us as far as our own human faculties. That's what allows us to approach Scripture and say, yes, this is authoritative and I should live my life by it.
Right. So first they show that, the first step here is that God is, there is a God, theism is true. And then that Jesus Christ is God. And when we get to scripture, then what they're saying is now God has given us reason. And so we can use our reason to this God-given reason to show which is the correct revelation of God. And so reason then, as we saw at the beginning of this particular section, shows scripture as the conclusion of their argument, and they don't start with scripture. All right, and then secondly, what is their a view with regard to disproving other worldviews, right? So notice our authors tell us that a worldview is the sum of a person's basic assumptions. It's either held consciously or subconsciously about life and the nature of reality. So the sum of a person's basic assumptions about life and the nature of reality. That's what a worldview is, kind of a down and dirty definition here of a worldview. And they tell us that these assumptions or presuppositions are sometimes only brought to mind when challenged by a foreigner from another ideological universe, right? So sometimes we are not aware of our assumptions or presuppositions until we meet some person, that has a different basis for their particular ideological universe. And so classical apologists generally maintain that while there may be many internal variations, the actual number of basic worldviews they're going to argue here, and we'll see it, is really quite limited. There's only just a few, actually a handful that they need to consider. And so that's their approach with regard to worldviews. There's just a few, and so we'll deal with the few that are basically present themselves.
Right. And so we've gone over kind of the key people within the classical approach as well. And so depending on when they existed, what they were responding to, or just kind of who they are and what their approach was, might inform them and have different classifications. But overall, they're going to try and codify and classify these different worldviews to make it easier to respond in a general way using their method. So there are different ways of categorizing worldviews because of areas of overlap. Sire devotes separate chapters to 8 basic worldviews: Christian theism, deism, naturalism, nihilism, existentialism, Eastern pantheistic monism, and the New Age and postmodernism. Norman Geisler and William Watkins in Worlds Apart, in another evangelical overview of worldviews, distinguishes 7 worldviews, with their lists differ in some respects from Sire's: deism, pantheism, panentheism, finite godism, polytheism, atheism, and theism. So again, depending on how they're responding or in what way they want to respond to, you're going to find different ones. And in fact, we can even go down farther and farther here. Right.
And so our authors tell us that obviously there's more overlap here than may meet the eye. For instance, Searle's naturalism is the same worldview as Geisler's atheism, right? And nihilism and existentialism are philosophies that seek to apply the atheistic worldview to human life. Moreover, pantheism includes both Eastern pantheistic monism and the New Age. So narrowing the options then enables the apologist, from the classical perspective, to show that non-Christians, for them, the fundamental choices that are just a handful, that these are the various few fundamental choices. In fact, C.S. Lewis reduces the number of worldviews even further.
Right.
He reduces it to 3, right? So in broad terms, he held that most, if not all, people hold to some variation of these 3 kind of views of reality: materialism or atheism, Hinduism, of which Buddhism was a simplification, and Christianity, of which Islam was a simplification. So that's, C.S. Lewis narrowed it down even further to just these 3 basic views.
Right. So again, wanting to respond in a certain fashion, people would be aghast that Islam is on probably both sides is responding to a simplified version of Christianity. But having narrowed the worldview options to a manageable number, whether 2, 3, 7, or more, the classical apologist then examines the alternatives to theism in order to show that they are to be rejected. The basic strategy here is to show that there are other worldviews are rationally incoherent. So they are false because they don't they're not rational in and of themselves.
Right. They don't hold together very well.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Which Nancy Pearcey has done in her book that we went over, Finding Truth. This is a familiar step to the show and to other people, and you have followers of Norman Geisler, like Frank Turek, who also looks at worldviews and also applies this rationally coherency to different worldviews that he's responding to as well, which sometimes feels a little bit on the presuppositional side. And, stealing from God title is always one that I'm kind of chide my teeth at. And I think he just needs to come over to our side and leave his Catholic brothers. I kid. Well, other considerations may also be pressed. For example, that they are in conflict with specific facts or that they are unlivable. But the characteristic emphasis of the classical approach to refuting non-Christian worldviews is to show that such worldviews are logically self-contradictory and or self-refuting.
Right. So the book gives us several examples, but we'll kind of pick out one here so that you can kind of get a feel for how this works. So the classical approach to refuting these non-Christian worldviews can be illustrated here with pantheism, for instance. So most non-theistic religions have affirmed one of the many forms of pantheism, all of which in some way identify or equate God with the all. Right.
Yeah.
So that God is in some sense the ultimate and only reality. So God is everything. Right. So notice Geisler notes that pantheism is a comprehensive philosophy that focuses on the unity of reality and seeks to acknowledge the immanence and absolute nature of God. In spite of these positive insights, though, he suggests that pantheism is an inadequate worldview because it is actually unaffirmable by man.
Right, right. And, you might think, oh, this is kind of a belief in the 80s and 90s, but I'm reading Rosario Butterfield's 5 Lies of our Anti-Christian Age right now. And this is a subject that she covers as one of the 5 about, I'm spiritual. I'm not religious type deal. And she has a conversation with a person who kind of, I am God and we are God together and we are all God and everyone's right except for then when Christianity is confronted in their face and they're like, oh, I can't believe you're being, evangelized and you're being brainwashed. Children, run away from your parents because I feel sorry for you. So this is still a belief that's being held even today.
Yeah.
Well, specifically, it is self-defeating for a pantheist to claim that individual finite selves are less than real. To assert, I believe that I am not an individual is to utter a self-refuting statement because it assumes the existence of the individual who says, I. This is Ayn Rand's anthem. There's no I. It's always a we. You're dichotomically having to, in your own mind, refer to yourself as both a number and also a part of the collective. And so you are trying to get away from this individual statement, but then the character, I always forget the numbers for it, but learns of this individualistic breakthrough of the letter I, and so that unravels the whole case for Anthem. So someone who says I while at the same time denying it is then self-refuting their claim. Mm-hmm. So pantheism wrongly assumes that whatever is not really ultimate is not ultimately or actually real.
Right. And so there's the rub there with regard to it. So pantheism also cannot adequately account for evil, right? It asserts that evil is an illusion and is meaningless since pain, the problem here is that how can it be an illusion with the classicalists would say, because pain is really felt. So right. It's not right. And it's unable even to distinguish between good and evil, since in theory, all is one. Nothing can be evil as opposed to good. Right. And so Geisler, for instance, argues that to say that God and the universe are one says nothing meaningful about God, and is, quite frankly, indistinguishable from atheism.
Mm-hmm. Right. Again, wanting to be spiritual, wanting to go to the buffet and pick out the salad and the steak and then some chicken on top of it, and then cap it off with some soft serve ice cream all over everything. So it just winds up a mess. All right. Well, proving God's existence. How does our classical brothers do this? Well, disproving non-theistic worldviews and philosophies of life does not necessarily prove theism, right? So you knock down all the pins and you're like, there, we're the only ones standing. Well, hold on. That might be the case, but how are we certain that there's not some other 11th pin in this frame and we're not able to knock this down? We can't just assume that you've knocked them all down. Well, classic apologists therefore offer a variety of arguments to support theism. In brief, four major arguments for God's existence have dominated the classical apologetics. First is the ontological argument, and the second and the third are known as the cosmological and the teleological arguments. And the fourth major theistic argument emerged in modern times and is the moral argument.
All right, yeah, so those four. So notice classical apologists are careful, though, to issue certain caveats about the use of theistic proofs. One such caveat is that the theistic arguments, as they are popularly understood, are often invalid. That is that, they need to be formulated carefully and rigorously if they are to be valid. Second, most people actually, do not need to hear theistic arguments since they are not atheists, right? What they need is evidence that God is the kind of God found in Scripture. And so what we'll take a look at here is three of the four major theistic arguments in this particular chapter and focus on how their classical formulation as philosophical proofs for God's existence work. And then our authors want to change, put off the teleological argument and discuss that in chapter 10.
Right. All right, well, we start with the always fun one, the moral argument. Well, the moral argument relates to the universality of moral experience and holds that unless there is a God, there's no ultimate basis for moral law. If you've seen William Lane Craig argue before, this is a favor of his, and so you might not think that from his writing, but this tends to be one where he really harps on or makes the other side focus on more and more because he doesn't believe that there is an ultimate basis for morality if there's no standard moral giver. Well, classical apologists answered the objection that ethical judgments vary from place to place by arguing that regardless of time or culture, there is a built-in concept of normative conduct, a universal sense of ought and should. So, when you ask a consistent atheist, why ought you do something, then the consistent atheist should say, well, there's no ought, but there is it would be nice, or it would work out for the best as far as an ends to a means. We hope. Hope might not be within their desired vocabulary, but a longing for an outward expectation there.
Yeah, right. So notice it is true that people can acknowledge the moral law without seeing that the moral law as a theistic proof, but this does not mean that such a law could have real validity, says the classicalist, right, apart from God. So the real thrust of this argument lies in the fact that when people express approval or criticism of the actions of others, they are behaving as if theism were true. That is, as if there are such things as absolute rights and wrong. And so classical apologists typically argue that one would have to assume this position in order to criticize it as wrong. So notice, as you mentioned, this kind of approach, this moral argument kind of strikes me as really close to a presuppositional approach, right? Really, what you're asking is, what has to be the case for morality to be meaningful? Mm-hmm. And of course, that's a transcendental question, right? That's the kind of questions that presuppositionalists ask about rationality, morality, logic, all kinds of things. And so, this argument, even when it's used by classicalists, always strikes me as a kind of a presuppositional approach to argue.
Right. Yeah. Watch any YouTube video where Turek is talking to college students and talking about this. It's always, how can you say that is wrong? By what? Well, we don't want to say by what standard because that might make us go look elsewhere. But that seems like it's the one potato in the barrel of apples. There just right. Feels like it's a little bit off from the cosmological argument there.
Right, and oftentimes this argument is confused because people take this argument often as saying, so are you saying that an atheist cannot be moral? Right. And that's not what the argument is saying. Right. The argument is saying the atheist has no grounds for morality. Right. In other words, he can't really give us a good answer to the question, what has to be the case for morality to be meaningful? right? So he doesn't have a ground. So it's not that, people that don't believe in God can't be moral. Yeah, they can not lie and that sort of thing. But why, right? And what is the grounds for that? How do you, what's the justification for that? Well, I just, human, flourishing. Well, why is that such a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Why not, I don't know, ant flourishing?
Yeah. Or just a me flourishing.
Yeah, really.
I don't care what happens after my 70 years, but I want all the stuff before I die. So there we go. That's how you know who wins. Right. Yeah. Well, and that, that's the early parts of Romans. You have Romans 2 and 3 talking about this. Even the Gentiles hold themselves up to a standard. But they even fall under its own weight. And also then why do they hold themselves to this standard? And so that's part of Paul's early introduction of this all men knowing type deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get into the nitty gritty of the classical approach. So the ontological argument is kind of probably maybe the one most associated with classical, I would say. So the ontological argument is the only philosophical theistic proof that reasons is a purely a priori fashion from certain assumptions or ideas as a given. So it's right. It's a thing that just is known. There's no working up to it. You just have that knowledge of right. it.
Now, and I'm not sure if I would suggest that the ontological argument is one of their main arguments. I think probably the cosmological argument.
Oh, that's
is
true.
Is probably one of the main. This is one our authors are kind of going to dismiss this one actually as being part of their entourage of arguments here. But let's kind of work our way through it so that we can understand what this one is all about.
Yeah. So there are many forms of the ontological argument, and some are too technical to discuss here. Very technical. Perhaps one of the simplest forms, if any of them may be called simple, is based on Anselm's second version of the argument, as restated by many various modern philosophers.
Right. And so there's various versions actually of all of these arguments that we're going to work our way through here as we go. And so this is this ontological argument. It's based on, ontology is the idea of being, right? So God is a being that exists. He's the greatest conceivable being. That's the kind of the basis of this argument. And so here's kind of the premises and conclusion of what our authors suggest are the second version of this argument that Anselm posits here. First, the existence of a necessary being must be either a necessary existence, or an impossible existence, or a possible but not necessary existence. Right, so that's the first premise. Secondly, but the existence of a necessary being is not an impossible existence, because as far as we can see, there is nothing contradictory about the concept of a necessary being, nor is the existence of a necessary being a possible but not necessary existence, since this would be a self-contradictory claim. Therefore, the existence of a necessary being is a necessary existence, and the conclusion then is therefore a necessary being necessarily exists, right? So this is kind of, I kind of see this one as kind of a magic trick, right? You do all of these definitions, and then all of a sudden, poof, God kind of pops into existence as a result of these various definitions,
right? Right. But he's necessary, like that. In order for us to see the magic show, there has to be a magician in order for the magic show to even be here. So yeah. Well, although classical apologists employ a wide variety of arguments for God's existence, most do not accept the ontological argument. Most apologists and philosophers continue to accept the rebuttal that the ontological argument commits the fallacy of deducing the existence of God from the concept of God, right? So if you define God as all the ways necessary for him to exist, then coming up with this argument almost seems like a back-end form of argumentation for it. For example, the formulation given above can be criticized by alleging that all point 4 means is that if a necessary being exists, his existence must be a necessary existence. This still leaves open whether a necessary being exists in the first place.
Right. So notice, if we assume that a necessary being exists, right, or that the greatest conceivable being exists, then it seems to me the argument kind of works. The problem, as being pointed out here, is why make that assumption, right? Why do we have to make that assumption? Right? And so that's kind of the issue that many people have with this particular argument.
Right. All right. Well, that is halfway through our chapter and kind of halfway through our different arguments for God. And so this is kind of a good place to stop for this episode. Recollect, figure out what that ontological argument actually meant. See if you can come up with something better. Publish, prove the existence of God, and win your Nobel Prize that way. We're going to continue next week then with chapter 6, looking at the rationality of the Christian worldview from the classical model approach. So hopefully you're starting to kind of see the layout of this book and what the next other 3 different methods will look like, and this same type of response that each one will make a claim either positive or negative or both, and then we'll kind of put them in a pit at the end and let them duke it out. So, well, we'll just say check out caveofthecross.com for all the short clips and all the full episodes, book reviews, anything else that I feel like posting up there. And you can check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and various any other ones, podcast catchers, so you don't have to watch us, but also on Rumble, Odyssey, and of course the YouTubes. So we just thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.